Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the second of the Enrichment in the Fall Keynote talks. I'm Michael Baruman from the Red Sea Research Center, and it's a pleasure to have you all join us this afternoon. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to be sure to thank the Office of the Enrichment Programs, Mari Lohr, as well as Professor Omar Canillo, who has coordinated the enrichment programs for this cycle. So let's give them a hand for all their work. And there are many people in the center who deserve some acknowledgement as well. So Christine Nelson, and as well as the team with Seda and Manal. I think many of you have seen a lot of advertising on campus that there's also a biodiversity conference that starts tomorrow, which our center is organizing, and welcome anybody who would like to come see those talks. So it's really convenient for us to have enrichment focus on marine biodiversity as well, at the same time that we have a workshop on biodiversity. I also want to extend a special welcome to Vice Dean Dr. Mansour Al-Ghamdi, who's joined us from King Abdulaziz University. Thank you for being here. He's the Vice Dean in the College of Meteorology, Environment, and Arid Land Agriculture. So thank you very much let's welcome him and his group from Jeddah. We also have very regular interactions with several of the students from the high school in Thual, so let's welcome them as well. If you can all say hello. Thank you for being here. So, and then on to to give a brief introduction to our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Gregory Skomal is a senior fisheries scientist at the Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries. In particular, he's a shark biologist, and as you may have guessed, and he is in charge of the Massachusetts Shark Research Program. Greg is an old friend and a colleague, and I think you'll really enjoy his talk. He did his undergraduate work and his master's work at the University of Rhode Island, and then went on to do his PhD at Boston University. So he works with a state fisheries program, but he is also a very active scientist, and as such, he holds adjunct faculty positions with the University of Massachusetts, as well as an adjunct scientist position with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And so just as a very brief explanation, when I was working at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and we stumbled across I don't want to give away too much of his story here, but we stumbled across whale sharks in the Red Sea. And Greg was the first person we called and said, who can help us tag sharks and understand what's happening with the sharks? So we got Greg on one of the trips, and he's been a regular participant in these projects, as well as even helping co-supervise students and things since then. So let's give Greg a very big welcome back to KAUST, and we look forward to hearing about the secret life of jaws. So thank you, Greg.
Thanks, brother. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful introduction. It is great to be back at KAUST. It's been far too many years. I haven't been here, I think, since 2012. And Michael mentioned the early work we did together. This is a photo I took of Michael underwater, which we spent a lot of time back then underwater, but it was all about these great majestic fish on the right there, which KAUST, Michael's group, his students did an incredible job. And in my opinion, one of the most intensive studies done on whale sharks in such a short a period of time, and really cutting-edge research that's ever been done. And so there's more to be done with whale sharks, and perhaps I'll finish with that, like Luis did yesterday, make a little plug for future work with KAUST, and because this particular university is well poised to do this kind of work, and the groundwork has been laid for whale shark work. But I want to thank Michael for bringing me here way back then and bringing me back here now, and Omar and just everyone for welcoming me back. It's a short trip. I'm not going to be able to stay much longer because I'm in the middle of my field season, but I'm enjoying every moment I'm here with you folks. Today I'm going to talk about the new kinds of technology that are being used to study sharks, but I want to set the stage first and tell you why we're doing that. And it's simply because the numbers of sharks being landed in fisheries globally have increased dramatically over the last several decades. And here you can see a paper published back in 2013 that shows dramatic increases in the landings of shark and shark-like species, rays, skates, chimeras, since 1950. And these dramatic increases are driven by largely expanding commercial fisheries all over the world. And unfortunately, we are not well poised to stop this because we're not well poised in terms of knowing the biology of these species. And when we look at the biology of these species, there's Michael again at a market in Dubai showing a fin, and a lot of the growth in the commercial markets globally is driven by the demand not only for protein but for fins as well. And if we look at sharks and what's going on with the group in general, and we have over 500 different species, and I think that's important to realize that we have a lot of different species of sharks, and they're throughout the world. You know, they're in populations throughout the world, and we don't know a lot about those populations. And the IUCN has done a great job of looking and tabulating what we do know. And we do know at least 17% of these species are endangered or vulnerable to being endangered. Some are near threatened. Some are of very little concern to us. In other words, they're not being over-harvested. But the big number that jumps out at me and should jump out at you is this 49% that you see right there that are data deficient. That means almost 50% of shark species we don't know enough information about to determine whether or not their populations are growing, are shrinking, are being overexploited. And without that kind of information, we can't move forward with trying to stop it or at least manage it at sustainable levels. And so what is this information that's lacking? And you'd be very surprised because it largely centers on basic biology, natural history information, age and growth, reproduction, trophic ecology, basic questions about what these animals are doing in time and space, you know, stock structure. How do we manage stocks if we don't know what they are? And that links to essential habitat, movements, distribution, and ultimately movement ecology. So these are the areas that I've spent a lot of my career looking into, studying a variety of species. And so over the course of my career, a lot of my work has been focused in the North Atlantic. And so we will spend a lot of time today in the North Atlantic, and then we're going to eventually spend a lot of time on the great white shark, which is really good example species of the kinds of techniques and technologies we're using to study movement ecology. But I've worked on everything from short-fin makos to blue sharks to basking sharks. I've traveled to other parts of the world to study the Greenland shark in the Arctic Circle and gray reef sharks in the Pacific, applying new tools and new techniques to see what these animals are doing in time and space over multiple scales. I'm going to use the white shark as a great example, and believe it or not, we typically don't think of these big charismatic sharks that have movies made about them and hundreds of documentaries as being data deficient. But remarkably, we don't know a lot about the basic natural history and biology of the great white shark. And I'm going to focus on the western North Atlantic because that's where I spend the bulk of my time doing my research on white sharks. We will wander off in a couple of other areas as we move on through this talk. But I wanted to summarize what we know about the biology of this species in this part of the world. So we have a general idea of its distribution, and I'll show you that in a second. We know from a physiological point of view that this is a unique species. The white shark, like its closest cousins, the mako, the porbeagle, the Pacific salmon shark, can raise its body temperature. It's endothermic. That means it's basically warm-blooded, which is very, very unique among fish species. So there's a bunch of work done back at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that looks specifically at endothermy and endothermic fishes. But that doesn't tell us a lot about the natural history of the species. And when it comes to life history, we know a little bit about age and growth. We have some information that indicates that it's a long-lived species, 70 years plus, based on bomb carbon work that we've done, showing that it's a long-lived species that grows incredibly slowly. We don't know a lot about its reproductive biology in terms of where males and females mate, how many young females have, gestation period, those kinds of things. Nursery areas, not well understood in the white shark. We know a little bit about feeding ecology because of some stable isotope work done by Leland-Hamady over at Woods Hole Oceanographic over the last few years, but we don't know a lot. There's a big paucity of data when it comes to natural history of this species. Population assessment, we looked at a whole bunch of indices of abundance over the course of the last 50 years and got a sense that the population was once hit very, very dramatically in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the expansion of fisheries in the North Atlantic, but seems to be rebounding as a result of protections put in place by the U.S. government, Canada, and other governments around the Atlantic. So it appears to be responding to conservation. And when it comes to movement ecology, we know absolutely very, very little about it. So this is where I'm going to focus my research, and I'm going to give you a sense of the tools that we're using to do that, and then the broad-scale movements, and really tell you how little we know about where these sharks are spending the bulk of their time, and that is in deep water habitat. And what I want you to get from this is for the big portion of this, the first portion of this, we're going to talk about our observations of these sharks at or close to the surface in epipelagic habitat, in shallow waters, where we can see what these animals are doing. And what you're going to find out is they spend actually the bulk of their time, over 50–60% of their time, at depths well beyond our reach. And that's when we have no clue what they're absolutely doing. If we look at the distribution of the white shark globally, we can see that it is broadly distributed, but there are these pockets of areas where we have aggregations of white sharks. This is where white sharks predictably go certain times of the year, and as such, it's given access to filmmakers and to divers, people who love to go diving with white sharks, and to scientists. And in some of these areas, like the Farallon Islands off California, or in Australia and South Africa, there's been intensive research done on this species in these aggregation areas. But how do we know what they do when they leave these aggregation areas? Well, we all put tags on them. Today, I'll focus, obviously, on the North Atlantic, an aggregation area that we've been working on for just about 10 years off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And we'll talk about specifically this area and how we've taken off on applying the technologies, but we are actually years behind what's been done in other areas. If we look at the history of the white shark in the western North Atlantic, we can go back and look at records of white sharks, and we've done that. 2 papers, one by Casey and Pratt back in 1985, and another by Toby Curtis more recently. We went back and we looked at where the white sharks have ever been encountered by fishing gear. So these are largely fishing records. And what you can see here is over 600 little green dots that indicates that the white sharks distributed all along the eastern seaboard of the United States up to Canada. But these data, and it's important to realize this, are what we call fisheries-dependent data, which means they're reported by fishermen. They're fish that are brought in to markets or to marinas, where they're, in some cases, examined by scientists. And fisheries-dependent data don't always tell you all there is to know about the distribution of that species, because it largely reflects where the shark has been captured as well. So I want you to keep this graphic in mind as we move on through the talk. Little green dots, coastal species, eastern seaboard of the United States. So it seems to be associated with the continental shelf based on this data set. But we can also see that dating back to as early as the 1800s, there are records of the white shark all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. So we're not seeing any great expansion northward in their habitat. We have very good historical records that indicates this is where the species occurs. If we were to take these data and divide them out by each year, you'd actually only have 1, 2, or no little green dots, because the white shark, for the most part, has been extremely elusive in this part of the world, and that's why it's been very difficult for us to piece together the natural history of this species. Some of these little green dots are brought into the dock, and I think I've told a number of people this trip. A lot of my early work on sharks in general involved dead fish. I cut up a lot of fish. You know, it's kind of a classical fisheries biologist training and background where we learned a lot about the animal by cutting it up and examining various tissues. So over the course of my early years of working in the North Atlantic on white sharks, I had a chance to see a couple of these little green dots that were brought in. And here you can see a very, very young white shark that was brought in by a commercial fisherman, and we had a chance to dissect it, immature, about the size we think they're born. And here's a much larger white shark that we had a chance to dissect. And as you can imagine, you can learn a lot from a dead fish. If you look in its stomach, the most obvious thing, you can see what it eats. If you look at its reproductive system, you can determine whether or not it's not only male, female, but if it's mature or immature, so you can come up with size at maturity from those things. If you take a section of its backbone, you can count rings on the backbone and get a sense of its growth rate and age at length, information, and longevity. So a lot can be learned from a dead fish. Now, I've since moved away from cutting up a lot of white sharks, but if one does wash ashore or is brought in, I will take advantage of that opportunity. So I'm going to show you a white shark necropsy with this video that we did just a couple of years ago. It was a white shark that actually beached itself and died on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And working for the government, you know very well I don't work this fast, but we sped up the video so you wouldn't have to watch us go through this methodical dissection over the course of several hours. And what we're doing there is we're working with a number of institutions, academic as well as government and other labs, to maximize the opportunity and take these tissue samples so we can learn not only about natural history, but contaminant levels and muscle function, heart function, you name it. So we take advantage of these opportunities to learn from dead fish. But what they don't tell me is how these animals actually behave. You know, what's it like to study a live white shark in the Atlantic? And I didn't think I'd have this opportunity, quite frankly, until 2004, when a white shark swam into this estuary not too far from where I lived. And I spent 2 weeks with that shark, and we put, for the very first time, a Popup Satellite Tag on that animal. And these are tags that Michael's been using on whale sharks and now been used all over the world on a variety of shark species, as well as other fish species. And we'll talk more about that technology shortly. So something was changing around New England. White sharks were beginning to show up in greater numbers in very specific areas, and this was the first indication that this was happening back in 2004. This shark, unfortunately, was trapped in this pond, and it took us 2 weeks to get it out of the pond. And once the shark was out of the pond, I was very, very excited because I was convinced we would finally start learning from the tag that was on its back. And wouldn't you know it, 45 minutes after the shark got out of the pond, the tag malfunctioned and came off. So all I learned was that the shark was trapped in a pond for 2 weeks. Very disappointing. So I went from what I thought was the highest moment in my career, seeing a white shark and tagging it, to having absolutely no data from this fish. But things began to change around New England. And I mentioned those hot spots around the world where people predictably go and see this species and study this species. And the one thing that these hot spots have in common is food that looks like that. See, big white sharks don't want to chase around small fish. They want to eat big meals. They don't want peanuts, they want steak. And when a white shark gets to be about 3 meters long, it's big enough to be able to kill and eat large pinnipeds. And so these hot spots all have large pinniped aggregations as well. And so the overlap of these two species allows for an incredible predator-prey dynamic. So much of what we know about this species, the white shark, comes from one of these hot spots. So this is a photo taken around Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago. And what's happened around Cape Cod is we've been able to see the restoration of seal populations from levels that were on the brink of extinction. Seals and 4 species of seals that all lived off the northeastern United States and Canada were driven to very, very low levels by overharvest. And this happened over the course of several centuries. So believe it or not, by the end of the 19th century, there were no breeding populations of seals left off the east coast of the United States. In 1972, the United States, followed by similar actions taken in Canada, protected marine mammals, all marine mammals at the highest levels. And as a result of over 40 plus years of protection, we're now seeing the recolonization of the northeastern United States by seals and the growth of these populations in great densities. And if you're going to open up a restaurant this big, you're going to get something that shows up and wants to eat this. And that's exactly what the white sharks are doing. So now we've got white sharks showing up in greater numbers, not only themselves responding in terms of conservation measures that were put in place in the 90s on a population level, but also shifting their distribution to go to these high-density seal areas. So here's a white shark in hot pursuit of a seal in the shallow waters of Cape Cod. And for those of you who are not familiar with Cape Cod, it is a peninsula that extends off the northeastern coast of the United States. It's roughly shaped like an arm, and the seal populations amass on the outside, the eastern shoreline of Cape Cod. It's very shallow water. It's characterized by shifting sand and shoals that form, come and go each year, and high densities of seals and high densities of people. Cape Cod is a tourist attraction. It's a destination for people to go to every year in the thousands. So as you can imagine, the high presence of sharks and their prey creates problems, potential problems. So this particular seal got away because this particular seal knows that if you want to get away from a fish, you go onto land. This particular seal did not get so lucky. This was ambushed by a shark in relatively shallow water. You see the coastline here of the beach. All this is happening in areas of high densities of seals and people. So it's a bit of a challenge from a management point of view. So I'm going to show you a video of at a predation event. Music makes it far more palatable. We came upon this shark that was eating a seal, and he swam over to the boat and decided to show us. You see the boat that I use has a pulpit on it, so I can get out in front of the boat for tagging and for videotaping. The shark has the seal in its mouth, and what the shark's doing is it wants that thick, fatty blubber layer, rich in energy, and it's targeting that blubber layer. You would think that we actually see this happen all the time, and we don't. We've actually only seen predatory events like this maybe once or twice a year, even though there's these high densities of seals and high densities of sharks. Much of what we know about the predatory behavior of white sharks not only comes from Cape Cod in this way, but other aggregation sites. So virtually everything we know about white shark predatory behavior on pinnipeds around seal colonies is published from South Africa or the Farallona Islands. Near shore areas, shallow waters. And I'm keep going back to these shallow waters where we see these animals, and we virtually know everything there is to know about their predatory behavior only from these areas. This is a very interesting sequence that we came upon one day. It was seals and sharks in an area, as is typical this time of year in the summertime, off Cape Cod. And you can see there's a pile of seals in the upper left that is in very, very shallow water. Those are the seals that know that there are sharks out there, that there's something out there that wants to eat them. This particular seal that you see the shark looking at didn't get the memo and came out from underneath our boat. So we're watching this shark going back and forth, seemingly frustrated by the presence of all this food right on the shoreline that it can't get to because the water's too shallow. Until this small seal comes out from under our boat like it's going back to land It looks up, it looks over, and this is the split second that this shark sees the seal. Now, the seal doesn't have a lot of options, does it? The seal doesn't have a lot of options. My spotter pilot, his name is Wayne Davis. He is an incredible photographer. He's up in the air telling us where the sharks are so we can go over and study them and work on them. He, at this moment, said, there's a shark over here and a seal, and it's going to get interesting. This is the very next photo that he took. And what you see on the left side is the seal actually coming out of the water because it had no place to go except up, and the shark following it. So what you see on the extreme left, mouth of the shark, its jaws extended and mouth closing, missing the seal. So this video is the video that I shot from the pulpit of the boat on that GoPro camera. And you'll see this sequence, this predatory sequence. It was the first time we'd ever seen a shark breach after a seal, which is, of course, typical behavior in South Africa, because South Africa, you've got deep water, you've got sharks pitting the seals against the surface as they're coming to and from the island. Now, that seal went right up on the beach and never got back in the water again. So it's not the first time. That was the very first time I saw a breach. The second time I saw a breach was this sequence, which happened this year. And I felt a little bit like the seal. Go ahead and run that one. What we're doing is we're waiting for the pilot to tell us where the seal is, the shark is. So seemingly in the water ahead of me, there's a shark, but the water is extremely murky. I think I'm looking at the shark, but I'm not.
Holy crap! It dove right out of the water!
You see that?
Man!
Did you see that?
Get that on a boat.
If you didn't catch it the first time. We call it the white shark shuffle.
It, what?
Right up! It opened his mouth right at my feet.
This thing was running.
This you didn't
Did
see
you
on
guys
YouTube,
see
this
that?
part. I thought I had been seeing things, but that doesn't happen too often. You can go ahead and kill it. So these are the kinds of predatory strikes that we see and sometimes experience, but not enough to actually know how these animals are choosing their prey. And so what we've got here, and I've already talked about it, is you've got the overlap, though, of humans with these sharks. And this windsurfer had no clue that that shark was there. And then we showed him, and he sold his windsurfer. We've got surfers that are out every day. And when I talk to surfers, they say, we're more than happy to take the risk because we love surfing so much. And then here's a paddleboarder. These photos taken this year. And so when you've got the overlap of humans with this particular species, the potential for interactions is much higher. And unfortunately, we've had several attacks over the course of the last 5 years, one of them being fatal, the most recent in September of this year. And so now we've had somebody killed. So my research focus has not only been on learning about this species so that we can have sustainable management of it, but also learning about this species so that I can assist with perhaps helping with public safety. The more we know about the daily behavioral patterns of sharks around this area, the better we might be equipped to advise beach managers on how to best keep people from being bitten. And there's no easy way of doing that. But now that's something that we're dealing with now, each day as people go on the water and are willing to expose themselves to greater risk. So the way we go about doing this is the way a lot of researchers have gone about doing it over the last several decades, is we tag fish. Because we can only see them when they're near the surface, and when they leave, we have no clue what they're doing. So we use a variety of tagging technologies. And I have a fairly unique tagging technique because what we don't do is we don't capture the fish, we don't chum for the fish. The last thing I want to do is put a bunch of chum in the water, where there are people swimming. It's not a good thing to do. It doesn't go over big, and I want to keep my job. So what we do is I've hired a plane that goes up, and this is my pilot, Wayne. He goes up in the air and he looks for these sharks in shallow water. And once he finds the sharks, he directs our vessel over to them, and we're able to go up to the sharks and tag them and videotape them. And the reason we videotape them is because we can tell individuals apart. The color patterns that you see on these sharks, particularly where the gray meets the white underbelly, are very distinctive. Think of it as a fingerprint. Also, these sharks have scarring patterns and fin shapes that are very, very unique. So we can tell the sharks apart. So I'll go ahead and play a video of some of our tagging sequence. It's like a promo for a movie, right? And it's to try to get you excited, and maybe some of you students here are interested in studying these critters. And it gets the public engaged. You know, I do a lot of talks, I do a lot of films, and I try to get word out to the public because, as we all know, when you engage the public, you get them interested in what we're doing, and ultimately they want to participate and protect. I have one more video from this slide that actually shows a tagging. And it kind of goes through the sequence from the boat. What I had basically done was already videotape this shark. So we had plenty in the can in terms of who this shark was, male, female. We're getting size estimates as well. And now we're just waiting for the shark to cooperate. So what I've got there is a tagging pole with a tagging needle and an intramuscular dart that's inserted at the base of the dorsal fin. The pilot's speaking to the captain, who's up on the tower. He's got his camera running. This is always people that follow us, so they're following us to figure out what we're doing. And the shark you can see is swimming, comes back toward the boat, and I just pop the tag right in. And you'll see a little slow motion, a little close-up of that. And I'm just trying to place that dart at the base of the dorsal fin. You can see the blue acoustic tag that I've placed on the shark, and off it goes. And what's wonderful about those particular tags, and we can go ahead and kill that. What's wonderful about those tags is they last for 10 years. So it's an acoustic pinger. We're able to follow the movements of that individual shark over the course of a decade, which is a remarkable change in the technology that's occurred over the last 10 years. So in summary, since 2009, we've tagged, I've got to adjust those numbers because we've tagged a few more last week. We're almost up to 150 individual sharks. We've gone from tagging none to tagging over almost 150 males and females over a fairly broad size range with multiple technologies, and largely off that eastern shoreline of Cape Cod, again, that peninsula that extends out off the northeastern U.S. Today I'm going to focus just on our satellite technology because that's the one we're using to look at the broader scale, three-dimensional movements of the sharks. The acoustic tag technology gives us a great look at what the sharks are doing locally. So the way the acoustic tags work is they emit a very high-frequency sound. That sound's picked up by an array of acoustic receivers that we've set up all along the coastline of Massachusetts. So it gives us a sense of where the sharks spend their time, but not only where they spend their time, but when they arrive and when they leave. So we can look at seasonality of the sharks around Cape Cod. So when I tell you that they're there generally from June into November and then they leave, that's how we know that. We can determine where they're spending their time on a relative scale. Is it around seal colonies? Is it around swimming beaches? Is it around harbors? Where is it? And it's largely around swimming beaches and seal colonies. So the local movements come from these acoustic tags, and we're able to model those data to look at any specific individual patterns in behavior. And then we can pool those data and look at patterns within the species and among the individuals. So we're able to get a sense of what's driving these local movements. And the broader scale movement comes from the satellite-based tags. The Popup Satellite Tag is an archival tag. And all that means is it's a data logger. It collects temperature, depth, and light level information every 10, 20, 30 seconds, depending on how it's set up, and it just logs those data. Those data are then stored within the tag until a date programmed by the researcher. The tag comes off the shark, floats to the surface, and then reports those data to a satellite, and you do a retrospective analysis on what the shark did after you tagged it. So it's not a real-time transmitting tag. It's one that's used by a number of researchers. You know, Michael's put it on, I don't know what I want to say over 50 whale sharks. And it's a great technology because it not only gives you an estimate of where the shark went in a horizontal space, but also three-dimensional movement patterns. So the pop-up satellite tag's very common, but very expensive. The real-time satellite tag is one that's strapped to the top of the dorsal fin of the shark. Anytime that shark comes to the surface, transmits to a satellite, and you can follow it in real time. The problem with that is we're studying fish. Fish don't need to come to the surface. Some do, some don't. So using these particular tags become complicated because you have to capture the fish, and we don't like to do that in these areas. And then you have to hope that fish comes to the surface. So go back now to that very first slide of the green dots, and I'm going to show you the results of our satellite tagging data. First, I'm going to give you a size distribution, just so you know that we are tagging a fairly broad size distribution up to about 4-5 meters, males and females that are not only mature individuals, but some that we call subadults, but think of them in terms of like teenagers. And they're not quite adults yet, but they will be in the coming years. So we have a fairly broad size range. It is skewed somewhat to the subadults and adults. These are the data that are coming back from our tags. So if you go back to my little green dots, which showed that the white shark was a coastal species, you see that we are not capturing in those data, in that particular data set, we are not seeing what's the true distribution of the white shark in the western North Atlantic. What we see actually is much broader movements. And what I love about these broad movements is there's absolutely no pattern to them whatsoever. I can't find a pattern to those movements. It's almost like they're wandering nomadic movements. And when the sharks leave the continental shelf, they do some really amazing diving behavior. So this is one individual shark, data from one pop-up satellite tag, that shows that in September, October, November, that shark is on the continental shelf. It's on that shallow water shelf along the eastern seaboard of the U.S., not diving very often below 50 meters. When it leaves the shelf, those dives go as deep as over 1,000 meters through a very, 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 very broad temperature range. And of course, the same question you have is the one we all have, right? It's why? Why do they do this? And the more species of highly migratory fish we tag, and here's a couple of examples, the basking shark and the porbeagle shark, they exhibit this deep diving behavior to mesopelagic depths, 200 to 1,000 meters, and no one knows why. Oh, there'll be a few scientists out there, we all know them, who will tell you why, but they're making it up. They actually don't know why. They'll say, well, they're down there to feed, and I agree with that, they're probably down there to feed, but what are they feeding on? This is a shark that eats big prey. When it leaves the coastline, there's no seals out there, maybe an occasional whale or dolphin, but these are predictable movements to deep water habitat. And the same problem that Luis talked about yesterday in terms of getting to this habitat and seeing what's going on face us as well. I mean, how do we find out what these sharks are doing? And it's something that a lot of scientists have been struggling with. There are some who believe they're going out to these areas to reproduce. But why would you move from a very small area where you're all aggregated to a much broader area in order to reproduce? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So what actually is going on, not only in the white shark, but in these other species? And we can look at tunas, we can look at swordfish. We're seeing these kinds of movements. What's going on in this open ocean habitat? And as much as I love the tags we use, as much as money we spend on them, they don't give us a clue as to what the sharks are actually doing. What are these fish actually doing? We know where they're going, and we make up the rest, because we really don't know what they're doing. And so how do we answer that? And Luis did a great job of running through the costs yesterday of what it's like to use big ships and submersibles. So that's really not an option. Besides, you're trying to find a needle in a haystack. So one approach that we decided to use, and again, I throw this up there because almost everything we know about these sharks in terms of their behavior comes from surface observations. And when we look at our data, we got 60% of their time spent well below the surface and some of that time at mesopelagic depths. How do we answer these questions? So the approach we took was to try to use AUV technology. And Woods Hole Oceanographic has a wonderful program that has been working in developing AUVs for decades. And there's all kinds of models. And typically what these vehicles are used for is mapping or locating air disasters or shipwrecks, and they do a wonderful job at that. They can go to depths that we can't routinely go to probably at a fraction of the cost of what it's like to deploy a submersible. And so they've got multiple models, and I approached these folks at this lab, and I said, can we follow a fish with one of your vehicles? And honestly, they laughed. They said, Greg, our vehicles can do everything from mow the lawn to find a shipwreck, but there's no way we can follow a fish. So we got to talking more and more about it, and we realized that if we could I asked them, I said, how do you get the vehicles, how do you send commands to the vehicles? Well, it's a highly proprietary software system where we have the vehicle talking to an underwater modem through a transponder system. And I said, how big's the transponder system? Well, it's about that big. I said, well, what happens if I put that on a shark? Because I got pretty good at putting things on sharks over the years. They said, well, I guess they would talk to each other and it would follow. I said, that's exactly what we want to do. So that was the concept. Play a very sophisticated game of Marco Polo by putting the transponder on the shark and having the vehicle interrogate the transponder. They have a wonderful conversation, and it looked really good on paper, and it looked really good in this graphic, but we weren't sure whether it was actually going to happen. And so we tried to figure out who could we go to fund this, and NSF wasn't particularly interested in it because it was too outlandish. So we went to my friends over at Discovery Channel, who were more than happy to write big checks for this because I promised them the world, and knowing very well there's no way I would deliver. But we had to test the technology, and in one of the first films we did using the technology, there's a sequence where I take the transponder and I put it on an underwater vehicle and I just zip around, and the vehicle actually is able to follow me. And just think of it as a robot or a drone that talks to the transponder, which is now strapped to that vehicle. So these early tests work, and we wanted to take it up to the next level. And so I knew we couldn't graduate right to white sharks because white sharks are far less predictable than other sharks that I've worked on. And one of those sharks is clearly one of my favorites. I've done a lot of work with them, the basking shark. The basking shark is the world's second largest fish. And one of the things I hope you get out of this talk is the diversity in this particular group of fishes. Yeah, there's only 500, and compared to teleos, that's just a fraction. But the dramatic differences between these species is amazing. We got sharks that are planktivorous, and this is one of them. The basking shark is a filter feeder. It's kind of a whale trapped in the body of a shark. Feeds on tiny little plankton in the water column. It forms these aggregations. It moves up to New England waters, to temperate waters in the summertime. It forms these big aggregations, and then it leaves. And we did a bunch of tagging with these sharks to figure out where they go to. But they're relatively slow moving, particularly when they open their mouths. It's like opening an umbrella underwater. They come to a stop, and I figure what a great way to test the AUV technology. We follow these basking sharks because they're not going to go very fast or very far. So we did that. We ran some early tests back in 2012. It was phase 2 of our development. And here you could actually see the vehicle in the water close to the basking shark, but not really being able to find it. So there were a lot of modifications that needed to be made to the software within the vehicle. And think of it as really where all the improvements needed to be made. We had to have this vehicle making decisions not based on where the shark is, but based on where it was and where it's going. And that's exactly what Roger Stokey over at the Oceanographic Systems Laboratory did. He developed predictive models so that the AUV, based on these early trials, would go to where it thinks the shark is going to be in 3, 5, or 10 seconds. And that's what allowed us to start tracking more effectively. So although the basking shark produced a couple of tracks, you could see these big loops in the tracks, which is the vehicle going by the sharks, turning around and trying to find them. And these are the first tracks of any shark where we could follow it using a drone system. But we didn't get a shred of footage. And with the people writing the checks, that wasn't a good thing. We needed to get good footage so that they'd continue funding the research. And so we immediately graduated up to white sharks. But we did get some data about the depth of these sharks over the course of a couple of hours. And this is one of the basking sharks that we tracked. And this is the kinds of data we would normally get when we're tracking a shark actively, putting a pinger on it, sitting on the boat, and following the fish. And now we had a drone doing it for us. And we could look at the depth distribution. What's really nice, though, is we can collect environmental data using the AUVs. Remember, these AUVs are oceanographic instruments. What's really nice about the Remus units themselves is that you can add and remove all kinds of instrumentation. And so you can add current Doppler profiler systems. You can collect information about the environment that this shark is going, so you can quantify and model the habitat in which it lives. And that's critically important for future management. And so this was a great example, some of our first tracks of just going out and collecting simple temperature, salinity data, as well as depth of the animal over the course of a track. We moved up to white sharks that very same year in 2012 and started tracking using the Remus 100. Now, the Remus 100 is the least expensive unit they have. It's only, but it only goes down to about 100 meters, and that's a problem, as you'll see in the future. So we did a number of tracks off the coast of Cape Cod. Again, all of these are by the vehicles. And in some cases, we were able to get the unit very close to the shark and actually get some video footage. And I show this particular shot of one of my favorite sharks. Her name is Large Marge. Large Marge was about a 16-foot white shark that had scars on her fins. The way white sharks, all sharks, mate is the male typically holds on to the female. So this was some evidence obtained by the drone of perhaps a white shark mating activity that might have happened in the area. So I thought that was, okay, we're learning something from these vehicles. And as all of you know who've ever deployed new technology, you're forever, you're doing it in baby steps. So this, to me, was a monumental step forward. We're not only following sharks, but we're getting imagery of what's going on underwater. And then we can take all the information collected by the vehicle and we can produce these models and these graphics that show the three-dimensional movements of the shark. So again, pointing to the efficacy of this tool at collecting. But the Discovery Channel was keen to tell me that that was a great project, but we want you to go to a place where we can actually see the fish and see it better. So we moved the operation to Guadalupe Island off the coast of Mexico, which is characterized by high densities of white sharks, high densities of seals, in very, very, very clear water. And I reached out to my colleague Mauricio Hoyos, who's been studying white sharks around Guadalupe for many years, and I asked him, what's the big question that is burning in your mind? And he said, Greg, we've got lots of white sharks, we got lots of seals, but we very rarely, if ever, see white sharks attack and kill the seals. And I said to him, what do you think is going on there? And he said to me, I think the water is so clear that the sharks stay deep, they shroud themselves in darkness, and they wait for the seals to come overhead, and they attack from below. So I said, well, we're going to go out there. I said, have you ever seen white sharks eating seals? He goes, occasionally he'll see them scavenging a seal carcass at the surface, or he'll see scarring patterns on the seals on shore. But he's never actually observed the predatory event. And I said, this is the perfect scenario to use what became known as the shark cam. The shark cam. And of course, this is what Discovery Channel does. They don't want to say Remus underwater vehicle. They want to say shark cam. So we went out there using one of the tourist operations. It's a fairly remote area, and we set up. And we brought in this first expedition the Remus 100, which, remember, only goes down to 100 meters. And we've quickly found out that that's a problem. So I'll show you this video of the tagging of one of the largest, if not the largest, white shark I have ever seen. It is a shark that was named by Mauricio Deep Blue. You could see Deep Blue online if you Google that name. And what you'll see with Deep Blue is this is a 7-meter boat, and you'll get a sense of how big this animal is in terms of length, but more importantly, how big its girth is and how wide this shark is. And what you'll then see me do is place the transponder, which in these days was very large. You could see it's a fairly sizable transponder. I'll place it at the base of the dorsal fin right there, and then the tether will immediately break. So we all know what it's like to go in the field, and I'm sure I can talk to you about it, and have things just not work out. So here we had one of the largest sharks that I'd ever seen, and it swam off without the transponder, which is floating right over there. The transponders are very expensive. For those of you who are worried about the shark dragging around a big transponder, we send a message to it, the transponder comes back to us because it's expensive and we don't want the shark to have to carry that the rest of its life. So luckily, Deep Blue came back, and we were able to track, these are two different sharks, one in pink, one in white. This is with all using just the vehicle. And these horizontal tracks were really quite nice. You could see little loops, which are indicative of the vehicle going past the shark, coming around, and catching up with it again. And this is the vertical movements. And what I want you to see in this particular graphic is how close the AUV is in actually tracking and mimicking the vehicle, the shark's movements. And what you see near the end of this track is that 100-meter limit. So first couple of tracks, and we can go ahead and play this video. First couple of tracks with the vehicle following the sharks. And you can hear, this is the motor of the vehicle picked up by the camera systems. And this is, you'll see the footage is fairly crude because we're down at about 90 meters deep. We're following the shark. It's swimming along the bottom. So these are the first images of white shark subsurface. And again, I'm super excited because we're getting new observations. Yeah, it's just a fish swimming, but it might do something else. And if we can continue to follow it, and we can program these vehicles to stay back or get very, very, very close. You can see here, what I want you to orient to are the 6 cameras, one up, one down, one right, middle, left, and then this one's looking back and behind the vehicle, and down. So we started getting video back like this, which was very interesting, and first glimpses into how these animals are swimming and what they're doing down near the bottom, scarring patterns on their back, all those kinds of things, subsurface observations. So you can go ahead and kill that. But then we started getting tracks like this, and when you get tracks like this, you don't see anything. Because the shark is below the vehicle. I said to Mauricio, oh, I didn't know the shark spent this much time below 100 meters, and he said, I didn't either. And so the sharks are obviously going deep, but our vehicle can't see anything. But what I've done is I've coded some of these tracks with observations we were getting. And I want you to see that red observation there. And this is an area where the shark, as you can see, is well below us, 150, 160 meters deep. The vehicle's hovering at about 95 meters deep. And we can go ahead and play this video. So a lot of the videos that were coming back from the video looked like, from the AUVs looked like this, nothing but blue. And then something happened that we really didn't expect. And many of you have probably already seen this. That's a hungry fish. Well, a lot of things happened in the room when that came back to us. You can hear the vehicle's underwater modem system screaming. You can see the vehicle listing, and you'll see the shark then wonder why this vehicle didn't die. It's going to swim back, it's going to come up, it's going to be frustrated. The engineers were at some point, this shark is so frustrated, it's going to swear at the vehicle. You'll see that happen in a second. We couldn't pick it up with our microphones, but I can only imagine what it was saying right there. Something along the lines of, to heck with you. The engineers were not particularly happy. We'll play that next video. The engineers were wondering what happened to the vehicle and whether it would survive, and we actually had a breach in the hull. We could play the second video. And this is from the perspective of all the cameras. What I want you to do is look at this panel right here, one that's looking back and down. And you're going to see a classic predatory strike that we typically see at the surface for white sharks, but this is 100 meters below the surface. Ooh, ooh. Engineers don't typically like those sounds. Mauricio loved them. Not only did he recognize this shark as Lucy because of her tail shape, those are paint chips from the vehicle. There's Lucy's frustration. Not only did he recognize this shark as one he hadn't seen in a while, but also he felt it was proving that these sharks are staying deep and striking from below with great speed and stealth. We can go ahead and kill that. And so what we did was we plotted out where these predatory bumps and strikes and fall approaches were occurring, and it seemed to be predominantly along this band, which we thought of as a predatory strike zone subsurface. So we're getting real data back that's indicative of predatory events. And people say to me, well, how do you know it's just not mad at it? Because typically they don't do that when they're just mad. They stay affixed to it, trying to rip pieces off of it. These are predatory strikes. So phase 4 was pretty successful, and I'll end with phase 5. I know we're getting close. And phase 5 was, okay, we're going to go back to Guadalupe. We're going to go later in the season when the elephant seals are there and the big female white sharks move in to feed on these elephant seals. And we were going to spend 2 weeks, and not only we're going to bring Remus 100, we're bringing her big sister. And that's the Remus 600. The Remus 600 has a diameter like this. Nothing's going to want to attack and kill the Remus 600. It can go to depths of 600 meters, and it had lights and lighting systems. We were going to see what the sharks were doing down deep, and we were going to see this at night as well. And so I'll play this video clip, which is kind of a promo from the film, so I apologize for that, but gives you some of the footage that we were able to capture using the Remus 600. We want to go deeper into the night. We want to deploy longer. We want to follow these fish. Have a vehicle that can just plow right through that depth limit, go down to as deep as 2,000 feet. We've got cameras, we've got lights, so we can turn it all on and see what the animals are doing. I love that. Yes! Yes, 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 yes! Woo-hoo-hoo! Neymar!
It's been attacked! It's
been
attacked! There's bite marks on the bottom! Unbelievable. Here, look at these bite marks. Huge bite marks across the steel. Look at it, you can see it. I have to say I'm absolutely shocked that there's a shark big enough out there capable of doing such damage.
Now Shark Cam 2 is in the water, and for the first time, we are tracking a great white shark into the night. Yeah. Amazing, going to places, seeing things we've never seen before. And this is just the beginning, you know? This is just the first track. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen a year from then? What's going to happen with all the other animals we can track? Absolutely blows my mind. So what's going to happen here? So this is...
Uh-oh.
Oh! Oh my gosh! Was it her?
It was! I told you!
It was Scarborough. As you can see, the engineers adapted to the fact that these sharks were attacking these vehicles. We never expected it to attack the big vehicle. And again, we got great information. And what we saw, that behavior, we actually think was the shark resting at night, mouth agape, moving very, 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 very slowly. And one of my students has recently written that up. Hopefully she'll get it to publication format at some point. So we're moving in the right direction. Again, we do this with baby steps. And for me, you know, I'm using the white shark as an example. We've used the technology on bull sharks. We've minimized and shrunk down the transponder system. And I think, and this is the same kind of plug that Luis gave yesterday, I think it's time to go back to the whale sharks. And I know you guys are still going to the whale sharks. Perhaps the next step is, this is a well-studied population with a great foundation of research done already on it. It'd be a perfect species to take it to the next level in terms of this technology. So it's my plug for not only doing more research, but coming back here to KAUST. And with that, I'm going to thank a whole bunch of folks who've made this particular study possible. I'll promote my books that we've got out there about the research we've done, and I'll prompt you for any questions. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Greg. We do have time for a couple of quick questions.
She's asking whether the sex ratio is skewed toward females. And no, it's about a 50-50 ratio each year. The first couple of years we were tagging, we were not doing the GoPro footage, which is for the mark recapture study we're doing. And so we don't have sex information for those couple of years, but those were relatively low sample sizes. But those numbers have not been updated, and if we stratify by year and break it down by year, it's generally a 50-50 ratio. Maybe a slight advantage to the females in terms of numbers, but nothing significant. So he's asking, how do we know it's not just agonistic behavior? The shark is territorial or mad about the presence of this vehicle. And I think it's because the energy expenditure and the duration of time that the shark is actually spending during the event is indicative of predation. Sharks typically, when they elicit any kind of agonistic behavior or aggression toward anything, they're very short periods of time. They knock, they bump. They might bite, but very, very short periods. We think that the duration of the events and the strike from the distance at which they're coming with great speed and force, typically what they try to do is use body language to displace a competitor before going to anything that expends a lot of energy. And these animals are, for the most part, coming down from great depths and striking with great speed and stealth that would be really indicative of more, in my opinion, more of a predatory event.
Right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hello. Hi. The
Okay.
middle.
Yes, I see it. There was, go ahead.
I'm curious about the learning behavior of these sharks. Have you ever seen that if they strike once and they realize it's not food, do they keep doing it and then they eventually learn okay, this is not food, I'm just going to leave it and ignore it, or no?
Well, what I can say from our own observations is that they do learn, and it's been, none of the sharks that we previously attacked the vehicle did it again. But it's a relatively small sample size when you think about it. None of the sharks, with the exception of one, was any of the sharks that we were actually tracking either. There were other sharks coming up from depths and striking with force. And it's been demonstrated in other areas, particularly South Africa, but also in California, that these sharks get better with their predatory strategies as they come back from year to year to year. So their predation success rate increases from a proportional from, say, roughly 20% when they first show up their first year at an aggregation to over 50% by their fourth or fifth year. So they do improve in their ability to prey upon seals because they get better at it. So it's a learned behavior. They're hardwired to some extent, but it's a learned behavior. And also, it's been demonstrated that you can condition these sharks. So they learn, for example, in these tourist areas like Guadalupe Island, these boats show up, the sharks hear the sound of the engines, they know there's a free meal, and they show up. And what you're studying there is artificial behavior until you release it and let it go and you get away from it, you stop chumming, and then you see over the course of time what that animal does naturally, which is lurk deep and wait for the seals to leave the island and strike from below. All right, who's choosing the people? Because I'm not good at it. All right.
Hi, I have 3 questions from the Thule High School students here.
Oh, great. I'm gonna
One
get
is
stumped.
asking, where did you take the pictures and videos at? But I sort of answered that one. The other one, oh, okay, there's 4 questions now. Sorry.
Beautiful. Line them up.
One question is, I was talking to them earlier that, hey, sharks don't like to eat people, but you just told us that these sharks are attacking people. So are sharks dangerous to people or not? And the third question is, in the beginning, you talked about overfishing and sharks. So do you have a number of how low the shark population has become in the world, or like how many sharks we've lost? Was that it? Yeah.
All right, I'll start with the first one. Are they dangerous or not? And you know, by far, of the 500 plus species, 99.9% of them have never been implicated in any attacks on people. And then when we look at those that have been, and particularly those that have unprovoked attacks, we could really isolate 3 species that can be considered dangerous: the white shark, the tiger shark, and the bull shark. Although others have been implicated, those are the ones that predominate when it comes to attacks on people. But when we look at the probability of one of these events, you know, it's incredibly low probability. People say to me all the time, I'm going to the beach today, what should I think about? I always say drive safely, because your car is far more likely to hurt you than the sharks are. But nonetheless, in areas where you have high densities of seals, which are the prey of these white sharks, which is a inherently dangerous animal when they're interacting, and you put people in the mix, the probability comes up a little bit. So, you know, our last fatal shark attack prior to September was in 1936, all right? And then we had a series of events that have occurred since 2014. 3 of them were actual bites on people. 1 was fatal. So people are basically putting themselves at risk by going out into deep water and doing activities that are probably not smart. So it depends on time and place and where you are. And then in terms of, we talk about shark numbers and a lot of generalizations, like shark numbers are declining globally, and that's a true statement. But when we do that, we have to look at species and we have to look at location. You know, there may be parts of the Red Sea, for example, you know, and one of Michael's students, Julia, did a great job at trying to get a sense of what was going on with sharks in Saudi Arabia, and it looks like populations may be depressed, declining, or really collapsing. We just don't know how to quantify it yet, except for the fact that they are declining. Whereas we can look in other areas off the eastern seaboard of the U.S. where sharks have been increasing depending on species, but decreasing depending on others. So, you know, I think in general we could say that shark populations globally are on the decline, but there are some bright spots out there. But it's a great, great question.
During your talk, you made a couple of comments about the importance of pop culture and how this helps your work. On the same note, I just wanted to let you know that the shark population is going to increase. I say this because my little son, he wants to be a shark when he grows up, and this is all thanks to the Baby Shark Doo-Doo-Doo song.
I love that. My kids don't care about sharks for some reason. No, they talk about them every day. Yeah. Go ahead.
I guess that sharks are usually, especially the greater white sharks, are usually lonely predators. So they usually don't act in a social behavior. But what happens when there are high concentration of sharks in the same point, like the cluster you showed before? did they start to act like social predators? Do they use some kind of social method to get the prey? I mean, it will be easier for them and also help them with the competition to get a prey when there are so many.
No, you bring up great points. When you have high densities of white sharks in a very specific area, which clearly occur at these aggregation sites, you know, you wonder what the social pressures are and whether there's any interaction, you know, cooperative hunting tactics with individuals, or perhaps competition. And there's no evidence, and most of the work published on this subject has come out of South Africa and Farallon Islands. There does not seem to be any cooperative hunting strategies. If anything, a shark may kill a seal, and a larger shark will come in and say, "Thank you, I'll take that." And that's what happens. It'll displace the smaller shark. That has been demonstrated. And there also seem to be social interactions that occur in terms of one shark trying to move another shark out of the area. And we see a lot of scarring patterns on sharks that not necessarily associated with mating, but seem to be intraspecific interactions that are aggression to move another shark away, to displace the other shark. And we're also seeing what looks like, at least on Cape Cod, areas or territories that these sharks are setting up that might displace other sharks. So, you know, it's a great question, and it's an area that it's not well studied, but we have a little bit of data.
Okay, I think we'll have to stop the questions there, but if you want to have more chats with Greg, he'll be out in the lobby for a few minutes. Let's give Greg another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think...